I've been asked by the Center for Teaching Excellence to say a few words about my own approach to teaching. I decided to focus on my classroom use of the Socratic method. As I gave thought to what I might say on this subject, however, I quickly found myself entering into much the same awkward and self-conscious state that pianists find themselves in when they start thinking too much about where each of their fingers is going, rather than just playing the music. Talking about teaching feels, I must say, much the same. To avoid some of the psychological feedback that might otherwise result, I've decided, against any number of other and probably better instincts, to give a brief lecture on the method, rather than endeavoring to illustrate it by asking you questions, even though an interrogative approach, as you'll soon see, would in many ways have been much more appropriate. There'll be time at the end, however, for discussion, perhaps even a little Socratic discussion. But first, allow me to offer a few more or less sequential, professorial observations to get us in the mood. There's another reason for my initial feelings of awkwardness, however, which I need to mention before going on. And it has to do with what you might call my philosophy of teaching. The problem is I don't really have one. Oh, I have my tricks and strategies, of course. But what I know, or think I might know, on the subject of teaching isn't something I've ever attempted to describe or explain in a systematic way, even to myself. What I tend to do instead, whenever I'm getting ready to go into a classroom, is to keep a sharp lookout in my autobiographical rear-view mirror at the man pictured here, my own greatest teacher, John Crosset, a professor of classics at my undergraduate alma mater, Cornell College in Iowa. Crosset was a man who made you believe there might have actually been a real-life Socrates, and not just a product of Plato's embellishing pen. In other words, someone who could really see in advance where an interlocutor would end up 40 or 50 conversational moves in advance. Crosset was an incredible teacher, and perhaps the only person I've ever known to approach our profession in an almost totally Socratic way, noted here by one of his other former students, James Ariety. Well, none of you, I'm sure, will have heard of John Crosset before, but I'm guessing at least a few members of my audience will have heard of St. John's College, the oldest and no doubt most influential of this country's great books colleges. As you may know, what sets St. John's apart, with just a handful of competing exceptions, is the fact that the entire undergraduate curriculum consists exclusively of classic primary texts. Also distinctive, if not unique, is its use of the Socratic method. As you can see from this slide, St. John's makes a point of emphasizing, beginning right here on the home page of its website, that the real teachers at the college aren't the faculty, but rather the authors of the great books, from Homer to Freud. The faculty are referred to as tutors, not professors, and their role in the classroom is to assist students in digging deep in these books, by means of a pedagogy which, as I indicate here, is largely Socratic in character. Though I'm told by a former student of mine who now teaches on the college's Santa Fe campus, there's a considerable variation in Socratic intensity from tutor to tutor. Be that as it may, what exactly is this Socratic method? What did John Crosset do so well? And what do many of the faculty try to do at St. John's? To begin answering these questions, I've divided my comments today into two basic parts, theory and practice. Let's talk first about theory. Many years ago, I wrote a doctoral dissertation on the poet, literary critic, and philosopher Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And I must say, I still find his description of the Socratic theory of education to be one of the best and most eloquent. As we can see from this passage, from Coleridge's Essays on the Principles of Method, education for Socrates, hence for the Socratic pedagogue, is not a matter of insertion or information, but rather of activation and excitation. The education of the intellect, Coleridge writes, by awakening the principle and method of self-development, was Socrates' proposed object, and not some specific information that can be conveyed into that intellect from without. The aim was not to assist in storing the passive mind with the various sorts of knowledge most in request, as if the human soul were a mere repository or banqueting room, but to place it in such relations of circumstance as should gradually excite the germinal power that craves no knowledge but what it can take up into itself, what it can appropriate and reproduce in fruits of its own. To shape, to dye, to paint over, and to mechanize the mind, Socrates resigned as their proper trade to the sophists, against whom he waged open and unremitting war. Well, that sounds quite profound, doesn't it? But just what does it mean? What are the distinguishing elements or characteristic features of this Socratic approach? To try to answer these questions, I've listed here a few of Socrates' own conceptual keys to the method, as we find them expressed in a number of Plato's dialogues. Permit me to offer a short lesson in Greek. First is anamnesis, or anamnesis, to use the more familiar pronunciation in English. Anamnesis means remembrance or recollection, and it's linked to the distinctively Platonic claim that learning is in fact a calling to mind of things already known. All knowledge is buried deep in the soul, and consists of memories drawn from a time when, as Socrates says, the soul journeyed with God. Second, maieusis. Maieusis is Greek for obstetrics. Here we're reminded of Socrates' ironical claim that while he himself has no wisdom at all, he nonetheless has the skill of a midwife, the ability, in other words, to assist other people in giving birth to the ideas already latent within them. Maieusis is thus a means of inducing anamnesis. As I'm sure you can see, there's a close connection, therefore, indicated here by my orange asterisks, between the maieutic process on the one hand and the etymological meaning of education on the other. To educate is in fact to lead out, the assumption being that students already have within them all the requisite principles, and that our role as teachers is to draw forth this dormant knowledge, waking it up and bringing it into the clear light of day. Third, elenchus. Elenchus is the Greek term for what a prosecuting attorney does in a courtroom as he tries to trip up witnesses for the defense by getting them to contradict their previous testimony. In a word, to practice elenchus is to cross-examine. It's what Socrates does in Plato's dialogues, with, of course, fatal effects for himself, as he seeks to expose the inconsistencies and logical errors of his interlocutors. Fourthly, and finally, aporia. The first letter of this word, a, alpha in Greek, is a negative particle, while the root poria is related to the English word pore, that is P-O-R-E, which of course is an opening, as in the pores of one's skin. Adding the negative leaves us with the sense of no opening, no exit, no way out. In the Socratic context, it's a way of describing the confused and stymied state into which one is led by elenchus, a state in which one can see no way of resolving the contradictions between what one has come to realize are the deepest truths and various surface assumptions. Well, putting these several elements together, I think we can sum up the fundamental aim of Socratic teaching by saying that it seeks to provoke not profess. In other words, to get people to see for themselves what is so, rather than simply telling them. And if that's true, it follows, as I suggest in this slide, that the sine qua non of the method is a kind of professorial self-effacement. Whether one happens to be a physical scientist, like the fellow pictured here at his blackboard, or an art historian, or sociologist, or linguist, or indeed a scholar of any discipline. Let's admit it, one of the toughest things for most academics is to hold back what they know. An ancient Chinese proverb, probably Confucian, tells us that he who knows 10 should say only 9. And a certain verbal parsimony is certainly part of the Socratic story. But what I've got in mind at this point actually goes much further. Professorial self-effacement means ultimately a willingness to get lost, to become so fully of one mind with our students that we allow ourselves to become entangled momentarily in their own doubts and confusions, as did Socrates himself on occasion. I'll return to this important feature of the method a bit later. The point I'm trying to make, though, can perhaps be better understood if we draw once again on some etymological insights. Consider the meaning of professor in light of its two Latin elements, pro, meaning before or in front of, and fatere, meaning to avow, proclaim, or attest. Putting these elements together, we can see that a professor is someone who openly or publicly declares or asserts something while standing in front of an audience. Given that definition, it should come as no surprise that a professor's classroom usually looks like this. The T, or teacher, as P, or professor, stands at the front of the room. He's considerably larger, as you can see, than the S's, that is, the students, who are ranged in uniformly receptive rows before him. Both the greater size of the P in relation to the S's, and the fact that the flow of the teaching is top to bottom and unidirectional, help to show that the professor alone is fully active in this kind of classroom, while the students are passive. Now, in contrast to this model of the lecture hall, I suspect some of you will have conjured up a rather different mental picture when you hear me use the term Socratic. Perhaps, in fact, this picture. This, as you may remember, if you're as old as I am, is the actor John Houseman as Harvard Law School professor Charles Kingsfield in the 1973 film The Paper Chase. I realize it's a dated image, but according to Wikipedia, which I just checked this morning, the Socratic method is still, and I quote, widely used in contemporary legal education by most law schools in the United States. Whether that's true, I'm not myself in a position to judge. But what I can tell you is that if Professor Kingsfield is an example, however exaggerated, of what a law school education is like, it's not, in fact, a Socratic education, or at least it's not what I mean by Socratic. On the contrary, it's really a pseudo-socratic method. Here, as you can see, our teacher, T, is no longer a professor, P. He's now an interrogator, I. And his job is to call upon individual student S's, like the hapless Mr. Hart of the Paper Chase, demanding that they divulge some particular fact or sequence of facts. Notice that the I remains in full control of the class. Bold arrows shoot forth as his questions, with rather paler, littler arrows venturing their obedient responses. All right, but if that's not what I have in mind, if that's not the right picture, what is? Well, admitting as one must that no mere diagram can capture any classroom's dynamics, I suggest that this might be a better way to image the style of teaching that I at least regard as Socratic, and which I myself try to practice. Notice that the T is now neither a P nor an I, but a D. I'll tell you what that means in a second. But even before we get to that, you'll have noticed that the teacher is now part of the circle of students, and he's considerably diminished in size. He still stands out, of course, being blue and not black, suggesting, very rightly, that he still retains some form of leadership, as indeed he must. But it's a leadership now more interwoven within and responsive to the rest of the group. As for what I mean by calling the T a D, I mean that he's a dialectician. Now please don't misconstrue me here. Dialectic, as you know, can have several different meanings, and I intend only one of them. We're not talking now about a Hegelian or Marxist understanding of the historical process. We're talking instead about a way of conversing or engaging in educational dialogue. As you can see, I've once again attempted to mine the word's etymology, in this case its Greek foundations. Following up these philological clues, we deduce that a dialectician, in the pedagogical sense, is someone who picks his words, choosing them carefully from other possible words, and who then puts them to use in such a way as to talk through a given set of ideas, navigating, as it were, between a variety of possible outcomes. Well, that's a mouthful of speculation, I realize. Assuming that a picture is worth 1,000 words, let's go back to my diagram. The flow of a dialectical conversation, one in which a truly Socratic teacher is taking the lead, it seems to me, should look something like this. Notice that I've added some arrows of conversational flow to my earlier picture. Notice, too, as I hinted a moment ago, that the teacher is still in charge of the class. This isn't a bull session or a random conversation by any means. But, unlike the traditional lecturer, and unlike the domineering Professor Kingsfield, the dialectician, though in charge of his classroom, is nonetheless happy to relinquish control, picking just a few words out of the many he might have spoken, and carefully inserting them between his students' words only when he thinks they'll be helpful. The dialectician poses a first question. That's the red arrow emerging from his side of the circle. But when a student responds, he lets a second and then a third student respond in turn before letting the dialogical ball bounce back in his own direction. Batting this returning ball away, perhaps with a request of clarification or with a refinement of his original question, let's say that's the black arrow this time, he again gets himself out of the way and permits 2 additional students to enter the flow. As for the green arrows, well, they're intended to model yet a third similar pattern of question and answers. Needless to say, the number of arrows of each color is purely suggestive. At any given moment, a Socratic teacher may feel the need to inject something after only one student has spoken. But in another situation, he may not speak again until 10 or 12 students have first passed the ball amongst themselves. Perhaps I can underscore these important differences in classroom dynamics, and in turn give you a clearer sense of what makes the Socratic method truly Socratic, by contrasting 2 very different approaches to defining dialectic itself. What we have in this slide is a dialectician's approach, the approach, as you can see, of no less than Socrates himself, contrasted with a professor's approach, to wit, the professorial approach of Socrates' student's student, Aristotle. Notice that Socrates' quasi-definition of dialectic itself takes the form of a question. Aristotle, on the other hand, in typical lecture room fashion, simply gives us the answer, thus closing down discussion. Please note this too. The professors answer isn't, or at least isn't necessarily, in conflict with the dialectician's question. On the contrary, if we sorted through the meanings of hypotheses and principles, we might well discover that Aristotle and his intellectual grandfather were on precisely the same page. So it's not, you see, what they may believe that's so different. It's how they approach it. All right, as I turn now from theory to practice, or rather my practice to be precise, it's high time for a public confession. I have to admit, in all honesty, that I do a lot of compromising in my USC classrooms. I am by no means a Crosset, let alone a Socrates. When it comes to what we might call degrees of dialectical engagement, my own pedagogy ranges at best from what I call here moderate to high, if not in fact from low to moderate, where the standard set by a very high degree of engagement can be found, as I indicate here on the left, in Plato's dialogue, the Meno. If you've read the Meno, you may remember that this is where Socrates attempts to demonstrate the truth of his doctrine of anamnesis, or recollection, by cross-examining a young servant boy. Though the boy has had no training in mathematics, or formal instruction in any subject for that matter, Socrates is able, through a series of skillful questions, to draw forth, that is, to educate from him, a few of the basic principles of Euclidean geometry. Now, of course, even Socrates doesn't use questions all the time, even in the Meno. His interrogative sentences are always interspersed with declarations and imperatives, as were the sentences of my teacher John Crosset. Nobody, at least nobody in my experience, has ever tried to teach without stating something in the indicative mood. If the Socratic method meant a pedagogy based on nothing but questions, well, then not even Socrates was purely Socratic. I myself use at least some dialectical questioning in all my teaching. Even in my larger classes, such as Introduction to Religious Studies, Faith, Doubt, and God, and Christian Theology, classes which generally range up to 75 students or so. But it's obviously impossible to cross-examine a group of that size. So in those settings I compromise, diluting dialectic by combining it with two other things. First, my own written lectures, which the students are to read online before coming to class, and second, an opening, largely professorial presentation during the first part of a given session, in which I expand on the written materials using a few slides, more or less what I'm doing right now. In smaller seminars, however, including the honors courses noted here, my focus is more consistently and more emphatically placed on dialectic. Here's how I explain what I'm up to on my syllabi for those honors classes. This class is not a survey, I explain to the students, the goal instead being to plunge deeply into a few seminal masterpieces, coming to grips with their continuing importance. In a sense, the books are the real teachers in the class. As you can see, I'm borrowing this formulation from St. John's. The primary aim of the instructor is to assist students in the fine art of attentive reading, to promote a disciplined exploration of a few of the world's most enduring ideas. The seminar will be conducted as a Socratic discussion, each class beginning with a question or questions concerning the assigned reading for the day, and students are expected to join in a shared inquiry. The premium is placed on precision, explanation, and defense. Students are held doubly accountable. They must courteously listen to the contributions of others and patiently justify their own observations. While it is sometimes thought that Socratic conversation is less rigorous than a more didactic and professorial style, its rigor, I say, is simply of another kind. In the serious cross-examination of a text, the trajectory of thought is often unpredictable. I'll come back to that unpredictable character momentarily. It's certainly less linear than that of the lecture hall, as we've seen. But the intellectual commitment required, the daily vigilance, demands a preparation and yields a mental fitness not promoted by other forms of learning. These advantages, I tell the students, will be pressed to the full in this course. Now, you may be wondering how much luck I have in these classes getting and keeping a good discussion going. Do students actually respond to my provocations? Are the students vigilant? Well, yes, I'm happy to say that for the most part they do and are. Well in advance of registration, in descriptions of the seminars which students are able to read online, I always emphasize the importance of class participation. Students thus know, or at least they should know, what they're in for when they sign up for these courses. And to make sure they don't forget, I make discussion a crucial part of their grade. Here, in case you're interested, is my statement of policy in that regard, handed out the first day. As you can see, fully 1/3 of the student's final course grade depends on class participation, though I'm quick to admit that's not something easily quantified. I give them this scale, but I also emphasize that the highest grades aren't necessarily going to go to those who are most long-winded or who merely speak with the greatest frequency. What I'm looking for, I tell them, and trying to model, are contributions which reflect a careful, thoughtful reading of the assigned materials, and which help the whole class better understand the meaning and implications of those readings. All right, at this point, I'm sure you'd like to know what sort of questions work best. What are the most appropriate, most useful, most effective ways to generate a dialectical exchange and get the students involved? Truly Socratic dialecticians, unlike Professor Kingsfield, are not just fishing for facts. So what are they doing? And what should you do if you wish to emulate them? I have my own bag of tricks, of course, and I'll mention a few of those momentarily. But first, for a more generic answer, you might begin by consulting some of the pedagogical publications and online resources available from an organization called the Foundation for Critical Thinking. A booklet I myself looked at some years ago and found to be fairly helpful is the Miniature Guide to the Art of Asking Essential Questions. I've copied one of the diagrams from this booklet and placed it here on the right to give you just a quick idea of the sort of aids they provide. And I've highlighted a few of the questions I myself like to privilege, questions having to do with an author's assumptions and the implications of his claims. Questions the answers to which will require that one's students work their way through a series of logical steps, and questions that press toward greater clarity of interpretation and expression, and a greater depth of understanding. As I said, these questions are all pretty basic, generic enough to apply across many disciplines. If, however, you're interested in a guide that might fit more specifically into your own particular field, you might consider having a look at one of these other booklets, also published by the Foundation for Critical Thinking. As you can see, the Foundation's offerings include, among others, guides for teachers of journalism, engineering, and nursing, as well as assorted arts and sciences. As I said at the start, it's impossible for me to provide a recipe or formula for what I myself try to do in the classroom, a true philosophy of teaching, since so much of it's tacit, based as it is on the model and memory of my own Socratic mentor. But with that caveat in mind, there are a few guidelines for both students and teachers which I think you might find useful if you'd like to try your hand at this pedagogy. Here to begin with are some general rules for the students I often hand out at the start of the term. As you can see, I've borrowed them, though with a few modifications of my own, from a historian named Stringfellow Barr, who, together with the philosopher Scott Buchanan, was instrumental in creating St. John's first great books curriculum back in the 1930s. As Barr points out, they're really more hints than rules, since the sort of conversation we're talking about is and must be essentially spontaneous. So, hint number 1. The exchange of lengthy monologues should be eschewed at all costs. If discussions are to be probing and profitable, interlocutors must be brief and to the point. Socratic dialectic has a different code of manners from a dinner party, where religion and politics are sometimes forbidden for fear that rising passions might damage social intercourse, and where interrupting a long-winded and empty speech is considered discourteous. In dialectic, a politely inserted request for clarification, "What in the world did you mean by that?" analogous to a point of order in political assemblies, always has the floor. I encourage my students to interrupt each other, politely, tactfully, when they don't understand. In dialectic, democracy consists in everyone's listening intently, not in equal time. When a good basketball team is on the offensive, this is this man's bars analogy, its members do not snatch the ball from each other, but support the player who has it, who in turn passes it to a teammate whenever a pass is called for by, notice, the common purpose of the team. In dialectic, the opposing team is the difficulties we all face as we search for the truth. It doesn't matter whose mouth gets used in overcoming this antagonist, provided that, note, all are attending carefully and interrupting with questions when they don't understand. A 4th hint. Herodotus's anecdote, the ancient Greek historian Herodotus's anecdote that the Persians deliberated while drunk and decided while sober, implies that in the early stages of a dialectical exchange, a wild idea is often more fruitful than a prematurely prudent opinion. The imaginative and the unexpected were frequent ingredients in Socrates' own style. Number 5. Perhaps the most important rule of Socratic discussion was laid down by Socrates himself. Whithersoever the wind of the argument blows, there lies our course. This means that some of the forms of relevance that a judicial proceeding must exhibit, the forensic style and strategies of formal debate, are irrelevant to dialectic. The point is not to instruct one's interlocutors, not even to persuade them, but rather to think with them and trust the argument to lead to insight, sometimes to very unexpected insights. And a final rule of thumb: when free minds seek together for greater understanding, they tend, as did Socrates, to move with light-heartedness and a sense of the comic. The relevant jest is never out of order. Good conversation always combines high seriousness with pertinent playfulness. I tell the students this should be lots of fun. All right, those are a few guidelines for the students. But what in the meantime should we teachers be doing? Honestly, before giving thought to this talk, I'd never stopped to formulate a similar set of rules for the would-be Socratic dialectician. But for what it's worth, here's what I've come up with based on my own experience. First of all, pretty obvious, we should know the day's reading inside and out. Know it well enough that we could actually give a lecture on it. Secondly, though, we need to swallow that lecture. In other words, internalize it. After all, we're not going to be professors, we're going to be dialecticians today. Now, frame the main points of the lecture that might have been as answers to a series of questions. This may be one of the more important hints and rules. Frame the points of the lecture that might have been as answers to a series of questions. Plan to pose those questions to the students. I'll underscore the word plan here for reasons you'll understand momentarily. Now, vary the questions you ask. Some of those questions should be definitional, some analytical, some proportional, some spectral, notice the quotation marks, some evaluative. I better explain what I mean by these terms before going on. Definitional questions are obviously questions that seek to help students grasp the meaning or the meanings of a word, whether it's denotation or connotation. Crosset would sometimes spend a whole class or more helping us hammer out the meaning of a single preposition, and believe me, it was never boring. Analytical questions try to break complicated thoughts into smaller, more easily digestible parts. In order to understand, for example, what the logician Kurt Gödel means in the first of his incompleteness theorems, when he says that, and I quote, "Any effectively generated theory capable of expressing elementary arithmetic cannot be both consistent and complete," end of quotation, one obviously needs to know, among other things, what it means for a theory to be effectively generated, what makes elementary arithmetic elementary, what the difference is between consistency and completeness. These would be analytical questions. When I speak here of proportional questions, I have in mind queries that will help students understand the meaning of a given idea, let's call it X, in relation to some other idea, Y, by discovering whether, and if so how, they both fit into a wider web of conceptual relationships. Having understood the relationship of some A to some B, once that's nailed down, and now realizing that X stands to A as does Y to B, what may we conclude about X? That would be the answer to a proportional question. By spectral questions, I don't mean spooky or ghostly queries. I mean questions which seek to position some idea or issue along a spectrum composed of similar instances. So, if Kant tells us, for example, that one should act, quote, "only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law without contradiction," end of quotation, it'd surely be helpful for the students to think about where various sorts of rules fall on a spectrum or scale, in order then to understand more precisely in what sense the rule called a law is more binding than the rule called a maxim. Finally, evaluative questions open the door to expressing one's considered judgment as to what is true and what false, what is good and what evil, what makes sense and what doesn't. They're designed to get the students to commit themselves, and then, of course, to defend their commitments. An example, simple example would be, do you agree with Marx, let's say, that religion is the opium of the people? Why or why not? All right, that was all an elaboration then of rule number 5. There's one additional rule, however, that you should keep in mind if you wish to teach Socratically. Prepare, I say, to be surprised. Stay supple and flexible. Things will go awry. This is really a recapitulation, in a sense, of my point number 4, where I emphasized plan to pose those questions, but then prepare to be surprised. Notice that I've placed the word awry in quotation marks. What I'm trying to suggest by those marks is that a seeming tangent or distraction may well turn out to be unexpectedly useful. One of the most rewarding things about Socratic teaching, in my opinion, is that the teacher is never, or should never, be bored. Every day's a surprise, and it's important, this is part of the professorial self-effacement I spoke of earlier, not to judge prematurely whether a student's comment or question is on target or not. Like Socrates, and like our students, we must be prepared to follow an argument wherever it leads, and not to insist on imposing our own agenda too quickly. Now, of course, the word follow is crucial. There needs to be a method to the madness of even the maddest discussion. I said earlier that a good Socratic teacher is someone who's willing to enter into the puzzlement and doubts of his students, even to the point of sometimes getting lost in discussion. I should have added, however, that this loss must be confined to only one part or one level of the teacher's mind. For on another level, it's essential, obviously, that he maintain a map of the various questions posed and answers given in order, if necessary, and it will be necessary, to help his students trace their way back to the starting point. If you end up in a fix like this, where you've gotten yourself stuck like Theseus in the heart of a labyrinth, in this case a conversational labyrinth, you'll want to make sure you have an Ariadne's thread to get you back to the entrance. So, be sure to keep mental, or if need be, written notes as to where the dialogue has been and where it seems to be going. You'll discover in so doing that student contributions that may have seemed awry at the time can often serve, paradoxically, as memorable markers of one's dialectical path. Now, come to think of it, there's actually one more rule, or better perhaps, cluster of rules that I ought to mention. Rules which, in many ways, are the most crucial of all. They're alike in encouraging, I'll call it modes of fearlessness. If Socrates was willing to risk the hemlock, surely we should be willing to risk a petulant student evaluation or two. So here are my most important rules. Don't be afraid, I say here, to play gadfly or provocateur. There's much to be gained by the controversial remark. If I might venture a personal opinion, the contemporary academic student-as-consumer culture has made too many of us much too appeasing in our approach to our charges. Don't be afraid, I say, to put your students on the spot with your questions. I'm using that phrase, by the way, in both of its two distinct senses. By on the spot, I mean both in a certain trouble or difficulty and in a pressure-packed situation where an immediate response is expected. Also, don't be afraid to be koanic. You may not know that word. It's an adjective derived from the Japanese noun koan, which is a form of question posed by Zen Buddhist masters, and which is intended, not unlike Socratic cross-examination, to produce a state of perplexity, opening in turn onto unexpected insight. One of the classic and best-known koans, you've heard this, is, "What's the sound of one hand clapping?" Remember, in any case, the underlying aim of Socratic elenchus is to discover and expose an interlocutor's assumptions, in such a way as to reveal any inconsistencies there may be in his outlook. A revelation which is meant in turn to induce aporia, that is, a feeling of no exit or no room to maneuver, and hence to undercut presumption and disperse conceit. Fundamentally, as I hope you can see, Socratic teaching is a spiritual exercise for both teacher and students. It's a pedagogy, but it's also a mystagogy. In order to evoke, if I can, at least a rudimentary sense of what it feels like to create and then move through a moment of aporia, I'm going to use what I readily admit is a pretty silly illustration. If we were actually engaged in dialectic right now, rather than nearing the end of a lecture, I would pose a question, solicit some answers, and then probingly push a few people in my audience where it seemed to me that responses were potentially weakest. But instead of that, I'm going to offer a geometrical analog, and in place of questions, I'll give you a series of directives. This, if you will, in the spirit of the Meno. As you can see, what we have here is an L-shaped plane figure, 2 units tall by 2 units long, with the base of the L being 1 unit tall. Perhaps I should say that if there are any mathematically minded folks in my audience who can immediately see where this is heading, I'd be grateful if they'd refrain from divulging the secret. The point of this exercise is to work through a moment of befuddlement, a moment which requires, for resolution, the sacrifice of one's assumptions or expectations. And if you're not befuddled, it's simply not going to work. In any case, here's my first directive. Please divide this L-shaped plane figure into two parts, such that the resulting parts are congruent. Well, that's pretty easy, right? I'm sure you've all done this in your mind's eye already. All right, let's get rid of that line. Now for my second injunction. Please divide this L-shaped plane figure into three parts, such that the resulting parts are congruent. This too is straightforward enough, I expect. You've no doubt done this and this already in your mind's eye. Getting rid of these lines, we come to the third and last directive. Please divide this L-shaped plane figure into four parts, such that the resulting parts are congruent. If you've not seen this exercise before, and if you're not a geometer, I'm guessing your first response will be to try something like this. You'll revert to the line with which you divided the figure in half, and then add these two additional lines. Of course, as soon as you do this, you realize the result isn't right. We've ended up with two bigger triangles and two smaller triangles, not four congruent parts. So let's get rid of those lines. What's happened here, or this at least is part of the problem, is that you've been mesmerized into thinking that somehow or other this point must form a part of the solution. Dividing the figure into two and then into three has led you to assume, falsely as it turns out, that a division into four must also make use of that yellow point. But now you see it doesn't, and insofar as you see this, but don't yet see your way out of the trap I've deliberately laid for you, you're in aporia. The dialectician in me is tempted to leave you there, and to provoke you to work this out for yourselves. But since I'm operating in professorial mode at the moment, I suppose I'd better give you the answer. As it turns out, division into four congruent parts is actually quite easy once you let go of your attachment to the point I just mentioned and begin playing with other, I'll call them non-attached possibilities. You'll be in a position to see that it works like this. Now, needless to say, a full-fledged dialectical exchange is going to be considerably more complex and multifaceted than this example can show. On the other hand, this little exercise does serve to convey at least something of the sequence of mental states, which, as I see it, all good Socratic teaching involves. Dialectic proceeds, Socrates suggested earlier, by demolishing its own hypotheses. Perhaps we can now rephrase that by saying, instead, that it proceeds when attachment is followed by detachment. A detachment which is itself followed in turn by yet another attachment, and so forth and so on, with conversational progress being guided throughout by a self-effacing teacher who knows enough to know he doesn't know all the answers. When, some years ago, I mentioned my indebtedness to John Crosset on my weblog, singling him out as the very best teacher I ever had, another former student of his from the generation before mine posted a reply telling me I was wrong. Crosset, he said, was the best teacher anyone ever had. Given my memories of that pedagogical giant, I can well understand the sentiment behind this bit of rhetorical excess. Nonetheless, excess it is. There have certainly been other great teachers, and no doubt at least a few of them have approached their classes Socratically. As I bring these remarks to a close, I'd like to quote from a testimonial to another such teacher. A testimonial I found a few years ago in the Chronicle of Higher Education. It comes from one Ellen Handler Spitz, a professor of visual arts and aesthetics at the University of Maryland, who here recalls her memorable days as the student of a Columbia University philosopher named Mary Mothersill. It's evident from Spitz's comments that Mothersill, like Crosset, was a gifted dialectician. and that she was especially good, like him, at putting and keeping her students on the spot. No other teacher, Professor Spitz says, I ever studied with behaved like Mary Mothersell. 'Twas as though she were modeling for us the very process of reflection, rethinking for herself every argument from start to finish. As she interrogated us about the text, well, interrogated perhaps not like Professor Kingsfield, no step was glossed over or hurried. There we sat on our hard wooden chairs, trapped in varying degrees of puzzlement, aporia, forced to inhabit the wretchedness of our not knowing, desperately longing for closure, wishing for deliverance from the awkward void she refused to fill. Mary stood by. Rarely did she intervene or save a student, yet she always listened attentively. She was not indifferent. Not saving you in class did not signify abandonment. It was a means of compelling you to find out how to save yourself. From this experience, repeated weekly and relentlessly, I learned and relearned, or tried to learn, that true understanding requires patience. It can never be complete, and intellectual work must be done only by you yourself. It can never be done for you by anyone else. Well, I said at the start of this talk, I'd be leaving some time at the end for discussion, perhaps in fact for some Socratic dialectic. One way to move into this time is to raise a few questions about what I've just said. If this were one of my seminars, and if the lecture you just listened to were treated as the assigned text for the day, I might begin our class discussion by posing these questions. Number 1. Today's session was advertised under the title, The Socratic Method and Critical Thinking. But at no point in my remarks have I spoken explicitly about critical thinking. Supposing you were now asked to explain and defend the conjunction, and. What does my description of Socratic teaching tell us about the critical nature of critical thinking? What's being criticized, and why? Or a second possible question. Must one accept the metaphysical, we might even call it theological, implications of Socratic anamnesis in order to engage wholeheartedly in Socratic elenchus? What do you think? Or third, are Stringfellow Bar and Mary Mothersell at odds with each other? Bar insists on team play. Remember the basketball game? He claims it doesn't make any difference whose mouth gets used. According to Ellen Handler Spitz, however, Mothersell insisted on people saving themselves, we just quoted that, and instilled the belief in her students that intellectual work must be done only by you yourself. It can't be done for you by anyone else. So, which of these master teachers is right? Or are they both right? I suppose, since we're all teachers here today, and since our subject is a form of teaching in which questions predominate, yet a fourth question might be, which of these three questions do you think would generate the best discussion of my preceding lecture? Well, be that as it may, it's clearly time for me to begin practicing what I've been preaching today about professorial self-effacement, and to get out of the way. Thank you very much for your kind attention.